The community is extremely important. You know, the old saying, you know, it takes a village, and that is so true, because, you know, you have an offender, we can work with them, but they're going back home. And so the family, first of all, is a big area. Often we have, especially certainly with young offenders as well, sometimes it's like, you know, they kind of absolve, sometimes some parents do absolve responsibility in a way, and it's like, you know, we're the persons who are parenting that young offender. And it's important to understand that we have to work with not only the offender, but the families as well. My name is Goodridge. I'm a senior probation officer at the Barbados Probation Service. Yeah, I was born and raised in London, as you can tell by the accent. I was always interested in working with people in terms of behaviour, etc. So I worked in various social settings in London before I came to Barbados. So that would have been working with young homeless, working with ex-offenders. When I came to Barbados originally at age 12, fell in love with the country. I found myself to-ing and fro-ing most often, to the point when I realised this is where I wanted to be. So when I came to Barbados, I was given the opportunity to be a probation officer, fairly quickly actually, and that was good for me because I was able to transfer all the skills I would have had from working in London, working with the young people. So I was able to work with, I would say, my chosen field, which was in terms of working with offenders, ex-offenders. For me, it was really about, the interest came from trying to understand the behaviour and then trying to effect change. I've been working here for 24 years now. So I've pretty much predominantly for the last, as I said, 24 years been working with Barbadians offenders. But really what we class as the criminogenic needs, which are the risk factors for offending, they generally remain the same. These will be things like low education, attainment, lack of employment, drug use, associations not involved in pro-social activities. Those are the kind of areas that, you know, regardless of whether you're in England or in Barbados, they generally remain the same. My passion really is working with young offenders. I do a lot of program work at the Barbados Probation Service. At the moment we have a program that is due to start called Pruning the Roots, and that is looking at offenders, but we're looking at what are the root causes. You know, sometimes we label offenders, we label children, we label them with ADHD, we label them as somebody who's got conduct disorder, but sometimes it's more based on the fact that they've experienced so much trauma within the home, and this is the resulting behaviour. So it's important to understand what's going on in the family and the community as well. You know, we know that there's certain communities where there's a lot going on. We know that there's some young offenders. We have some offenders whose homes are literally right there on the block. So they're faced with, as soon as they come out of their doors, they're faced with the fellas there smoking, the violence and all the rest of it. And it's difficult because one of the things I would love to do is that when I work with young offenders, we really be able to remove them from that environment for a period of time so that we could work more intensely with them, because, you know, we work with them today, but they're going back home into that environment. And all what we put into them during the day is kind of lost by the time they get home, unless they're strong enough to be able to say, you know what, this is the road I want to go down and I'm not going to be influenced. But we've got to remember that some of these youngsters, you know, their brains are not developed until age 25. So what we expect them to be able to do and the reasoning, etc., you know, we can't expect the same for them as we would for a man who's in his 40s and 50s. So, so with the communities, it's important for the communities to be involved, you know, check on the fellas, try to guide. I know it's not easy, you know, young people, it's difficult, but it is important for the communities, you know, to be involved and as much as possible be able to help nurture some of these young, particularly the young offenders. The other thing is that we have the issues of those that have coming out of prison. Now, you've had somebody who's incarcerated, they have to go back home at some point. And that's when it's important for the community to, you know, as best they can, provide whatever support they can for that offender. One of the issues that we have is accommodation. When persons are coming out of prison, as I said, you know, family members may not want them back there. There's challenges with respect to where they go when they're being released. So that's where the family and you know, can assist. It'd be brilliant if there were houses where they could come out and, you know, maybe resettle before they go back into the community, because you've got somebody who's had a history of, let's say, drug abuse, and they're in prison. When they come back out, it's, you know, no matter what drug counselling they may have received in prison, but they're back to that same environment. Barbados is very small, so it's not like overseas where, you know, you could maybe move to another part of London or another part of England or wherever to get away from that environment, which may have, you know, helped kind of spur them on in terms of their offending in the first place. So if I go back a little bit, the role of the probation officer is really to protect society. And through doing that, how we do that is really to provide the courts with risk assessments on offenders. So we do pre-sentence reports. That's one of our fundamental roles, is to carry out, to prepare pre-sentence reports on offenders. And that can be for a range of offences, from murder to rape to gun possession, drugs. We deal with adult offenders as well as juvenile offenders. Within the pre-sentence report, we're looking at what is that offender's risk of recidivism, repeat offending. So the pre-sentence report is really an in-depth analysis on the offender. So we will look at their history in terms of education, in terms of employment, family background, who they socialise with, whether they associate with the block culture. Now, that doesn't mean to say that every block is problematic per se, but we know that there are some blocks where fellas may just hang out and talk and lime, and there's others that may be more in terms of them maybe planning offending, planning crime, drug use, etc. So we have to go into the communities. So again, the role of the probation officer, one day, it's so diverse, shall I say, because one moment we may be in the court, another day we're on the block where we're interviewing persons, we may be in the community where we try to get an understanding of the offender. And I must say, predominantly information that we get through the community is very forthcoming, because without that we don't have a real insight into, you know, the offender and some of the problematic behaviours that they may be exhibiting in the community. So as I said, in another day we may be in prison. So the job is so multifaceted, and all of that goes into the preparation of a pre-sentence report. So if we have, let's say it's a young offender, and we know that they've come through the school system, they haven't achieved any certificates, then those are the kind of things that we would try to encourage them, whether it's CXEs, whether it's skills training, those, you know, things that make them more employable in the future, because obviously lack of employment is a criminogenic need. That is something that can make somebody more of a risk for reoffending if they're not employed. So, as I said, so in terms of the role of the probation officer, it is to reduce the risk of offending by looking at the criminogenic needs. We liaise with various social agencies. So if, for example, the person has anger management issues, you know, they're getting into conflict in the community, conflict in the home, then obviously then we would need to refer them for anger management. If it's an issue of drug abuse, and there's a difference between drug abuse and drug use, you know, we know that, you know, persons may smoke, but it becomes more problematic if obviously their drug use is causing them to act a certain way. And that could be driving them to violence, and that obviously triggers mental health and all sorts of issues for certain offenders. The main issue may be, like, you know, you may have an offender that doesn't believe that drugs is an issue. So drug counselling may be part of the probation order, for example, but they're hell-bent on continuing to smoke because they just don't believe that it's a problem. So you may have resistance to that. They may have resistance, or they don't want to go for anger management classes. We have community service as well. I didn't mention that before. Community service is a sentencing option as well. You may have somebody that just refuses to do community service. You actually get some that just say, I prefer to pay a fine, because as far as they're concerned, they don't want to work for free. You know, so the resistance may be more so in terms of them fulfilling some of the conditions of the probation order, and in those instances then we would have no option other than to bring them back to court, and in those instances, you know, then they will get an alternative sentence. But by that time we've gone through it. We've, you know, any person, even if it's a young offender, a juvenile, you know, it's important to understand that we work with them over a continuous period of time for them to understand what the orders of the court are, for them to fulfill the conditions, whether it's making sure they continue to attend school, the counselling, all the rest of the interventions that we put in place. But if they continue to offend, then at a certain point we have no option but to bring them back to court. And the courts, for the last resort, and again remembering that it's about protecting society, if this young offender is hell-bent on assaulting and being violent in the community or at school, then there comes a time when we have to remove them from and put them in what we call a structured environment. So any kind of resistance will be more so because they're just on that path where it's difficult for us to be able to divert them. And so we have to then deal with them and enforce the orders of the court and any alternative sentences imposed in that instance. We do have females that commit offences. It's a lot less than the males. I mean, I would have to say probably only around 20% thereabouts in terms of females. Most of those offences, certainly for the female adults, tend to be more crimes of like theft, fraud and those kind of offences. We're now getting some that may be for assault and, you know, more slightly violent. We've had a few in recent times through the courts that may have carried a gun, possibly for their partner, or involved in some offences with a man. But generally, the level of female offenders is significantly lower than the men. The probation department, we predominantly work with what we would class as at-risk youth. We do have a service, though, that those that have not yet come through the criminal justice system, we try to work with them as before they get to that point. So sometimes we may have the school or a parent who brings that child into the probation department for us to work with them. We call that diversionary work. And so we're trying to put interventions in place to try to prevent them from getting to the point where they go through the court system. And for the most part that works, but then you have a number that again are just hell-bent on that sort of negative path that they've been on. And a lot of that again is stemming around the family, what's going on in the family and in the communities. So again, the influence, especially for those young ones, and the influences in the community, is very difficult at times to be able to divert them. And so they may end up committing a criminal offence, and then they come back through our system at probation as an offender at that point. The program that I coordinate is the Asan program. Asan stands for Acquiring Skills Men Actually Need. That is for young offenders between the ages of 13 to 16, high to medium risk offenders. When we do our risk assessments, I should have said before, when we do our risk assessments, what we do is provide the courts with an insight into the level of risk. So that goes from low, medium to high based on the different risk factors, criminogenic needs, as I spoke about. The Asan program specifically, we usually aim to work with up to 20 young men or youngsters between the ages of 13 to 16, as I said, who are high to or medium risk. And through the program, which is a one-year program, and it also includes a camp, we usually try to involve a residential aspect as well. Within that program, we are addressing, again, the specific criminogenic needs of the offender. So the program tackles drugs. We look at drugs and offending, we look at drugs and mental health, we look at drugs and anger management, all of that. Sometimes they think, ma'am, it's always drugs, but drugs is a precursor to a lot of offending, even though persons might not believe that. I would say predominantly 80%, pretty much of our offenders will be using drugs. So it may well be a catalyst for some of the other offending. So we look at drugs, we take them to Verdon House, the drug rehabilitation unit, we take them to the prison so that actual offenders can speak to them. It's all good and well some of the officers talking to them, but when you have real life offenders in prison that are the similar ages to them, young offenders, and they can say to them, young men, you need to stay in school. Young guys, you need to, not commit crime because this is where you can end up. So we give them that real life situation so that these men can tell them firsthand where some of the behaviours that they're exhibiting at that point, where they could end up. We involve the Barbados Defence Force as well. They come in and they do various leadership, motivational skills with them, various tasks that they set with them. And so the Barbados Defence Force, we go to Paragon, we go to the Coast Guard, we have the NCSA that deals with drugs and anger management as well. So we have various persons. We use predominantly males because these are for males, and we try to use predominantly male facilitators, young male facilitators that look like them, so they can relate to them better than they would probably relate to myself or some of the other probation officers. The recidivism rate for the Asan program over the years, I would say, is on average 12%. Now, if you think about the national recidivism rate being up to nearly between 50 and 60%, then you can see that that program works. Out of 20, you may have one or two that may reoffend, and so far that generally they've been what we would class as petty offences as opposed to the most serious. And these offenders are the type of offenders, because they are medium to high risk, could move on to being the future murderers, could be the future persons armed with guns, etc., out there. So I take great pride, and I know my team and the department takes great pride in knowing that how we can change the lives of these offenders, and we see it in them from fairly early on in the program, where you can see the change developing and the thinking, the thought processing. We try to look at consequences, and that's what we're really trying to hit home, is the consequences, choices and consequences. So again, yeah, as I said, that is a success for me. That's the part of the job that I really enjoy. Seeing the young persons develop into pretty much, law-abiding young men. And the other one is just, when we've worked with persons one-on-one through normal supervision, you see them years later and they come back and they say, "Ma'am, I remember you helped me," or, "Could you provide me with a reference?" I don't think there's most places in the world that a probation officer will be asked to do a reference, but because of the type of relationship that we have with them, I think they recognize that as a probation officer, we're not there to basically lock them up. But I must say that, the role of the probation officer is different from the role of a social worker, because with probation, yes, we are using social work skills, yes, we're trying to empower the offenders, but we're also enforcing the orders of the court. So the difference is, with a probation officer, we've always, in the end, have to have that kind of a threat really over them, that if you don't conform, conform and comply with the orders of the court, you could end up back in court, and the results of that is, the probation order can be revoked, and they could end up with a criminal record, they could end up being in prison. So that's the difference between, as I say, a social worker and a probation officer. But as I said, I like the probation aspect, and I said, in terms of trying to protect society and seeing the young people that, for the most part, you see them turn their lives around. The first thing what I personally try to do is to talk with them, give them an understanding of what our role is. So for them to understand that my role is to prevent you from coming back to prison, if they're in prison, to prevent you from coming back in front of the courts. I want you to walk the straight path. I want you to be able to go to work, in the future, and come home, have your families, have your house, have your car, whatever your dreams are. But, and to understand that that is my role. And then through that, just establishing, just talking, on a certain level with them and an understanding. I think pretty much, for the most part, you know, we have a good relationship with probationers. Even persons where we're doing pre-sentence reports, at first there may be some kind of skepticism in terms of us and all the information that we're trying to ask them in terms of putting in the report for the court. But I always say, you know, it's not in terms of to be detrimental to them. It's for the court to have an understanding of what are your needs, what is the history, what has caused you to get where you are now, what interventions can be put in place now so that we can help you to divert from further offending. So I think once they understand that, we're able to build that rapport and relationship. And for those that are not incarcerated and are in a community and we're working with them, they see that we're trying to pretty much, you know, guide them and put them on the right path. And yes, you will have some resistance, but it's difficult sometimes to change behavior. You've got behavior that persons have had for 15, 16, 17 years, and we're trying to effect change within a year probation, 2 years probation. Some we manage to. But the other thing is you have to remember the influences out there is sometimes stronger than probation, stronger than the family, you know, the block culture, the persons that they're associating with. All of those influences, especially during adolescence, going upwards, is actually more significant, can be more significant than the family. Even working within the Asan program, the officers, you know, we noticed that even just in the general conversations that they have with each other, it's just violent talk. It's like it's the norm now. So, you know, you recognize that the young people are just a lot more angrier. They're violent in just their normal conversation. And so we're having to constantly try to educate them that if you talk violence, then eventually you're going to perpetrate violence. And it's happened. And so, again, within our programs, we just try to instill the anger management, the conflict resolution, those kind of techniques to try to get them to understand that there are alternative ways to dealing with conflict. But it is evident that, you know, you are seeing them, and there is a lot more violence, I think, going on. But we try to circumvent it as much as we can by trying to put the interventions in place. If you have some that just don't necessarily think about the consequences, it's like just this split moment. They just don't think beyond now. They don't use, you know, that kind of thought process to think, you know, if I do this, I could end up here. And that's where, you know, the supervision of the offenders, where the Asan program comes to play, to try to get them to understand that there are consequences. But then you've got some that, you know, when they're in a certain situation, all what you've done with them just goes out of the door because they're just hell-bent at that point. They're in that conflict and, you know, and they just react. So it is, the difficult part of it is just really trying to get them to understand that if you take this particular path or this particular action, this is the long-term effects. And not only just in terms of the now, but how this can impact you going down the road. We've had persons, you know, who have offended today, but yet a year or two later, they're coming back because they've now got this opportunity to travel. They've been offered an opportunity to work overseas or to work at a particular restaurant, which is, you know, wanting them to have a certificate of character, etc., etc. And they realize now that what they did back then has impacted them now. And so this is what we try to impart on the young persons now, is that, you know, right now, if you commit this particular act, you know, these are the consequences down the road that can affect you. But again, you know, the brains are not as developed. We know that the brain doesn't develop fully until they're age 25. So again, you're trying to impart this knowledge and hoping that, you know, for the most part, predominantly most of them, you know, understand that yes, this is the consequences. And I go back to the Asan program. I think, you know, they recognize or have recognized that, you know, through the program, we've hit home enough with them to understand what the consequences of their actions are. And I think that's led them to go down a different path. Employment is a big part of offending. when somebody has a criminal conviction, you know, their certificate of character is going to have that until eventually, if they're able or they know that they can get it expunged. I think it would be useful for some employers really to be able to give some offenders an opportunity, you know, particularly if it's an offence that's not necessarily related to the type of field of work that they may be in, because we know that, you know, the lack of employment, as I said, is a criminogenic need. You know, the average person who commits offences, etc., generally are not the ones who are in some kind of long-term permanent employment. So I believe employment is one of the biggest areas that can help offenders, whether it's those that are out in the community or those that are being released from prison. Employment is one of the biggest areas that we have the challenges, because we don't have jobs for them. When we do our risk assessments, that's part of, you know, whether we class somebody as a low, medium or high risk offence. So I'm not saying that somebody who's a high risk offender, you know, give them an opportunity to come and work in their shop or whatever the case may be. But there are persons who, you know, at age 16 may have, you know, committed a minor offence, but that record has, you know, continued. You know, they're 20 years old now, they've seen the errors of their way, they've moved on from that, but that's following them through. So, you know, again, it's just a case of being able to understand the path that that young person was on at that particular time, and recognising that they may well be on a different path now, and that opportunity to get, you know, steady income and employment can go a long way of keeping them from reoffending. Sometimes it can be extremely difficult. Part of the probation report, I must say, we have to do what we call a victim impact statement. So picture, you know, you're doing dealing with an offender who's committed murder, committed rape, committed a gun crime, etc. We have to actually interview the victim, so it may be the victim's family or somebody who's been murdered. That can be quite hard at times, especially at times, you know, we may be doing 2 and 3 of those kind of reports simultaneously. That can play, you know, very, very heavy. So when we talk of victims, we know that there's a victim, we know that there's a victim's family, we know that the perpetrator, you know, his family is, you know, a victim as well in terms of the offence. But I don't think people understand that kind of secondary victimization that even as a probation officer, you know, or secondary trauma that we experienced, not being able to go home and have somebody that you can talk to and offload with. The nature of the job, obviously we have a confidentiality policy. So, you know, you can't come home and say, well, yes, Joe Bloggs murdered so-and-so or did this particular crime. So that ability to be able to offload and debrief at the end of the day is not necessarily there. Yes, we can talk with persons at work, but that, as I said, in terms of self-care, I think it is important that self-care is built into, you know, your daily routine. And I think it's important for officers to, or any kind of social worker that's dealing with persons that have had any kind of trauma, to build that into their work, really. You know, make sure that they have some form of self-care built into their daily or weekly regime, really. So that's what I try to do. But it can be extremely difficult at times. But it's part and parcel of the job, and, you know, that's what we do.